How does a reputed mob boss transition from the headlines of crime to hosting a YouTube channel? Coming up next, this is James Proctor, and this is the first show in a series called Legends, where we'll take a gangster, sometimes well-known, other times less known, and take a deep dive into his story. Today, we're exploring the life of Joey Merlino, from his alleged reign over the Philadelphia mob to his surprising new role in the digital age. Joey Merlino's had an interesting public life, allegedly gaining control of the Philly crime family 30 years ago. He supposedly left the life a decade ago, which we'll discuss. Who would have thought that Joey Merlino would now be on social media, but as people in South Philly know, he never shied away from the limelight. This is going to be the first of a two-part series on the life of Joey Merlino, and we'll be discussing today his early life and the friends that he grew up with, along with his family roots in the mob. We'll also discuss how Joey was able to become a power in South Philly on his own, and talk about some of the major events that shaped Joey's life, like the Nicky Scarfo Jr. attempted rub-out. I invite you to explore the world of organized crime with me. Please like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay updated on our latest videos and exclusive interviews. I know you'll like the content. Joey Merlino was born on March 13, 1962 in Philadelphia. From his early beginnings, he was around the mob. His father, Chuckie, was a bartender, but was in the Philly mob as well, and Chuckie was good friends with Nicky Scarfo. When Joey was just one, you had an incident where Chuckie and Nicky Scarfo were at the Oregon Diner in South Philly, and Nicky Scarfo gets into an argument with a longshoreman named William Dugan. According to Phil Leonetti in Mafia Prince, Nicky Scarfo, who's 5'5", weighs like 135 pounds, had gotten into an argument with this guy Dugan, who was a big Irish guy, and the guy grabs Scarfo by the throat and pushes him against a counter and is choking him. Scarfo happens to be able to reach back and grab a butter knife behind him and stabs a guy in the chest, and it goes right into Dugan's heart, killing him. Scarfo and Chuckie get arrested for the William Dugan murder, and in the end Chuckie gets acquitted while Scarfo is convicted of voluntary manslaughter and ends up serving 6 months of a 23-month sentence. When Nicky Scarfo gets out of prison, the boss at the time, Angelo Bruno, sends Scarfo to Atlantic City, which is at the time a city on decline. Chuckie and his brother Lawrence, who went by the name of Yogi, were important members of Scarfo's crew, and eventually both of them got made in 1980. By then, Atlantic City was a booming city due to the legalization of gambling in 1976 and the building of numerous casinos. And by the late 70s, Scarfo's the biggest moneymaker. Angelo Bruno, who was the boss of Philly for 20 years, ends up getting rubbed out in 1980, which is the start of the first of 3 Philadelphia wars. Philip Testa is named the next boss, and he gets rubbed out as well by a nail bomb underneath his porch. Eventually, Nicky Scarfo becomes the boss in 1981, and he makes Chuckie Merlino his underboss. Nicky Scarfo's reign is one of violence, terror, and paranoia, and the paranoia was most evident in the rub-out of the son of Philip Testa, Salvi Testa. Salvi Testa was well-liked with the Philly family and was a good-looking kid. He took care of business on the street, very loyal to Nicky, and is actually one of Nicky's most capable soldiers. Salvi was also engaged to marry the daughter of Chuckie Merlino, and in 1984 he broke off the engagement, and that's when problems started to happen. So Nicky Scarfo got involved by telling Salvi it was okay to break up with his fiancée, and then Nicky would send word to Chuckie Merlino that Salvi was a jerk-off for doing it. So why would Nicky play both sides against each other in an apparent Machiavellian move? The real reason is that Nicky did this because he was threatened with the thought of Chuckie and Salvi being aligned, especially if he was Chuckie's son-in-law. And he also didn't like the attention that Salvi was getting on the street. On September 14, 1984, Salvi was found shot to death on the side of a road in New Jersey. And then in 1986, Chuckie ends up being bumped down as underboss by Nicky Scarfo. According to Phil Leonetti, Chuckie was bumped down for coming to a Christmas party and getting drunk, which was embarrassing to Scarfo. Also, there was an incident where Chuckie got into an argument with members of the Pagans Motorcycle Club and actually ran over one of them with a car. And we know that the Pagans later shot up the house of Merlino's mother. On the other hand, we also know that Nicky Scarfo was paranoid and was concerned that Chuckie could one day make a move against him. So Scarfo ended up making his nephew Phil Leonetti underboss after getting permission from the Chin, according to the book Mafia Prince. Going back to Joey Merlino, he grew up in a predominantly Italian neighborhood in South Philly, and the kids he hung out with were also sons, nephews, and cousins of gangsters. Joey was friends with future gangsters including Michael Ciccolini and Stephen Mazzone, and so he was around the gangster life throughout his childhood. Those friends stayed with Joey throughout his ascent into the underworld and made up the core of what was known as the Young Turks. As a teenager, Joey talked about how he and his friends would get into trouble by pulling pranks. They would throw eggs at police cars, but he really didn't get in any real trouble until he was 20 years old. In August of 1982, Joey Merlino and his friend Salvatore got into an incident at a restaurant in Atlantic City with two other patrons where the two patrons got beat up and stabbed. Joey ends up being found guilty of 2 counts of aggravated assault and 1 count of possession of a weapon. In August of 1982, Joey Merlino and his friend Salvatore got into an incident at a restaurant in Atlantic City where 2 other patrons got beat up and got stabbed. So Joey was found guilty of 2 counts of aggravated assault and 1 count of possession of a weapon in August of '84, and that resulted in the New Jersey Casino Control Commission banning him for life. According to an article in the New York Times, which was August 9th of 1984, 4 people actually got banned that day, and that included both Joey, his father Chuckie, plus Bobby Manna, who ran New Jersey for the Genovese family, and another Genovese named Alan Greco. So Chuckie ends up going to prison in 1988 for racketeering and drug trafficking, and by this time the Philly crime family was in a spinning free fall downward. Nicky Scarfo's been running the family since 1981, and again, like I said, it's been a time of paranoia and violence, with over 12 ordered rub-outs. And by 1987, Scarfo was in prison, and in 1989 is sentenced to life without parole. Scarfo thinks he can control the family while in prison, but his biggest ally, his nephew and underboss Phil Leonetti, turns on Scarfo. And by the time Scarfo went to prison, he had lost all support of his family and from New York. And there were concerns from those in the Philly family that Nicky Scarfo would try to keep control, and he'd do that through his son Nicky Scarfo Jr. And by now, the family was just totally done with Scarfo. According to Phil Leonetti, Scarfo Jr. was not a real gangster and should have never been in the life. Regarding Joey, in 1987, Joey Merlino and Richard Barone were involved with a federal armored express truck guard named Stephen Rinaldi. And they planned out this heist that Rinaldi would open up the back door of an armored truck and throw out a bag of money. Although it was supposed to be $352,000, it ended up just being $13,000. Joey gets jammed up in August of 1989 on the heist, and although originally denied bail, he is given bail later, but with a lot of restrictions, including wearing an ankle bracelet, not being allowed to be out after dark. On October 31st of 1989, we had the infamous Nicky Scarfo Jr. shooting, where he shot 8 times in a Bella Vista Italian restaurant. Amazingly, Scarfo survives as none of the shots hit vital organs. And then the authorities quickly blamed Joey Merlino on this attempted rub-out. However, when asked about it, Joey Merlino said he was at home when it happened. We know that nobody's been charged with the shooting, and it's true that Joey had these restrictions, but what do you think happened? Do you think that even though Joey said he didn't do it, did he just have someone else do the shooting? Personally, I think that whoever did the shooting, it was done to send a message to Nicky Scarfo Sr. that he was no longer able to call the shots in Philly. So in January of 1990, Joey ends up getting 3 years in prison for his role in that armored car heist. When Joey goes to prison in 1990, he's 28 years old. Philly's in a bit of a power flux at the time, and Scarfo's no longer in control. The Gambino family and Genovese family both were influential with Philly. It was John Gotti and Genovese who pushed for Philip Testa to be boss after Bruno was taken out, but not everybody in Philly supported Testa. However, Paul Castellano agreed that Testa should be boss of Philly, and he took part in making sure the opposition wasn't successful, as evident by the hit on Johnny Keys that was given to Sammy Gravano's crew. Even though he had Scarfo as boss for nearly 9 years, his reign actually weakened the family with the amount of rub-outs and the Philly guys that were getting pinched. So John Gotti decided that John Stanfa should be named the new boss of Philly. So who's John Stanfa, and why was he even made the boss? In many ways, it is puzzling that John Stanfa was made boss, but when you look at his history, Stanfa immigrated from Sicily in the early 1960s when he was a young adult, and he is originally in New York with a couple of relatives who were in the Gambino family. Stanfa has a wife, family to take care of, and he ends up in Philly, and the Gambino family does a favor for Stanfa by getting him hooked up with the Philly mob. For the most part, Stanfa was in South Philly with Angelo Bruno, but he wasn't really well known, and he was at a disadvantage because the Philly mob was mostly these local wise guys who had grown up in the area, and they were second and third generation mobsters. Bruno liked Stanfa, but he is basically a bodyguard and occasional driver for Bruno. And then when Bruno got rubbed out in 1980, Stanfa got hit too, but his wounds were superficial, and so you had some in the family that thought Stanfa was part of the conspiracy against Bruno. But we don't know if that's true based on my research. Stanfa ends up going up to Baltimore and works in a restaurant, mainly just trying to get away from all the heat. But law enforcement catches up with him. He's brought before a grand jury to give an account of what happened that night when Bruno was whacked. Prosecutor said that Stanfa lied on the stand, so they charged him with perjury, and Stanfa actually gets an 8-year prison sentence. Nothing's really heard from Stanfa until he gets out, which is in 1990, and then Gotti sends word to Nicky Scarfo in October of 90 that he's done his boss, would no longer be supported by the commission. Through Robert Bisaccia, the Gambino's main guy in Jersey, Gotti sends word that Stanfa's the new boss in Philly. That news isn't taken well by many in the family, especially the Young Turks. Even though Merlino was in prison, the rest of the Young Turks were involved in loan sharking, extorting local businesses, and gambling without having to answer to anybody. When Stanfa gains power, he expects the Young Turks to kick up and go through him. While in prison, we're told that Joey Merlino and Ralph Natal built up a relationship and that the two of them were plotting to take control of the family from Stanfa. A lot of what we know from Ralph Natal is what he said in his biography. However, much of what Natal said was embellished or outright lies. What we know about Natal is that he was originally a bartender in South Philly, and they eventually gained control of the Bartenders Union. He was an associate of the Philly crime family, and he did know Angelo Bruno. But Bruno never considered Natal as worthy of being made, because he was known really as a drug dealer. Natal was a tough guy on the street, though, and he didn't have any problems using violence when it suited him. And Natal was in prison at this time due to being convicted of insurance fraud in 1979 related to arson, and then in 1980 for drug trafficking. So he had a 12 and 15-year sentence that was run concurrently. And then in 1990, he meets Joey Merlino. So why would Merlino even deal with this guy, Natal? Well, even with his loud mouth and his lies, Natal was supporting Merlino at the time, and he also had people on the street who would help his Young Turks. So Merlino realized that he had a guy that wanted power, but also someone that would do what he was told. In many ways, it made sense because you could have a front guy who would take the heat off of Joey and his crew. In 1990, Natali conspired and ordered the murder of a bookmaker named Louis De Luca. In addition, there was a guy named Jimmy Brooms Diodorio who was shot 6 times and murdered while he was talking on the phone. And this murder was directly ordered by Natal. So you had somebody in Natal that would back his words up with action. On the street, Joey had Michael Cianglini, Stephen Mazzone, George Borghese, Tommy Horsehead, Scafidi, and Martin Angelina. And most of these guys Joey had known since childhood. So the Young Turks weren't going to bow down to Stanfa. And you see that they struck first with the killing of Felix Bocchino on January 29th of 1992. In April of 92, Merlino was released from prison, and he was entering a war zone. So how was Stanfa going to react now? He had a group that wouldn't listen to him, and they'd already killed one of his supporters. Was it a mistake to make John Stanfa the boss? If so, who should have been made boss when you had more than half the crime family dead or in prison? What's your take on Joey Merlino's rise in Philly? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the mob's past and present. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and may God bless you always.